The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the December rain. David Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the black leather as he drove nowhere in particular. This was his ritual. Every year on this date, he would drive these empty back roads until the pain became bearable again. 3 years. 3 years since the phone call that shattered everything. 3 years since Marcus and Emma never made it home from their trip to the farmer's market. A distracted driver checking his phone had stolen David's entire world in a single devastating moment. The dashboard photo of their last family vacation seemed to mock him in the dim light. Marcus's arm around David's shoulders, 7-year-old Emma between them, all three grinning at the camera without knowing their time was already running out. David had kept that photo there, a daily reminder of what love looked like before loss redefined everything. But tonight, something was different. Through the driving rain, his headlights caught movement on the shoulder of Route 47, two small figures huddled against an abandoned gas station, barely visible in the storm. David's medical training kicked in immediately. Children, alone Xiao, in weather that could kill. He pulled over, hazard lights cutting through the darkness like desperate prayers. As he stepped into the freezing rain, he could see them clearly now. Twin boys, maybe 6 years old, clutching each other with the desperate intensity of those who had learned too young that survival meant holding tight. The larger of the two stepped protectively in front of his brother, dark eyes wide with fear and defiance. Both boys were soaked through, their thin jackets no match for December's cruelty. Their lips held the blue tint that David recognized from his pediatric training. Hypothermia was setting in. The protective twin spoke first, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We're waiting for someone." They said to wait here, but David could see the truth in their trembling bodies, in the way they pressed against each other for warmth that wasn't coming. No one was coming. Not tonight, maybe not ever. David knelt in the rain, making himself smaller, less threatening. His voice carried the calm authority he'd used in countless emergency rooms. "I'm Dr. Mitchell. You're both very cold, and this storm is dangerous. Let me help you get warm." The boys exchanged glances, a silent conversation that spoke of shared trauma and learned mistrust. The smaller twin hadn't spoken yet, but his eyes held stories no child should carry. When David gently guided them toward his warm car, neither boy resisted. Sometimes desperation makes the choice for you. As the heater wrapped around them like a blanket, David saw something that stopped his heart. Bruises on their arms, marks that spoke of hands that had been anything but gentle. These weren't just abandoned children. They were running from something much worse. In that moment, sitting in his car with two terrified little boys who reminded him of every patient he had ever fought to save, David Mitchell felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Purpose. The same protective instinct that had made him become a pediatrician. The same love that had made him and Marcus dream of adopting more children, stirred back to life. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen when we're convinced we have nothing left to give. Sometimes saving someone else is exactly how we find our way back to ourselves. And sometimes on the worst nights, hope arrives wearing a child's face and asking us to remember that love doesn't die with loss. It just waits for a reason to live again. What happened next would change not just David's life, but challenge everything a small community thought they knew about family, love, and the courage it takes to choose both. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more tales of unexpected family, profound healing, and the quiet miracles that happen when love refuses to give up. Because some of the most beautiful stories begin with a single moment of choosing to stop when the world expects you to drive by. The emergency room at Metropolitan General buzzed with controlled chaos, but David moved through it with the quiet authority of someone who belonged. He carried the smaller twin, Ben, while his brother Alex walked close beside them, never letting go of David's jacket. Both boys had refused to be separated, even for the brief car ride to the hospital. Dr. Sarah Kim looked up from her charts, surprise flickering across her face when she saw David approaching with the children. Sarah had been David's closest colleague during his hospital days, before discrimination had driven him to the quieter world of clinic work. She knew his story, knew the pain he carried, and seeing him with these boys stirred something complicated in her chest. The boys need immediate evaluation for hypothermia and possible trauma. David's voice held the clinical detachment he'd perfected over years of emergency medicine. But Sarah caught the tremor underneath, the way his hand rested protectively on Alex's shoulder. As they worked to warm the boys and assess their condition, the truth began to emerge in fragments. Alex spoke in whispered Spanish, his English broken but determined. His brother Ben hadn't uttered a single word since arriving at the hospital, communicating only through desperate glances at Alex whenever anyone approached. The bruises told their own story. Finger marks on thin wrists, the kind of injuries that came from rough handling, from being grabbed and dragged. Sarah documented everything with the methodical precision that such cases demanded, while David found himself remembering why he'd chosen pediatrics in the first place. Children shouldn't have to carry these secrets. Maria Santos arrived as the boys were finishing their medical evaluation. The social worker moved with efficient kindness, her Latina heritage helping her connect with Alex in ways that English couldn't quite manage. She listened to his halting explanation about Tony, about being told to hide, about the scary men who came to the house late at night. David watched Maria work, recognizing something in her approach that reminded him of his own bedside manner from years past. She wasn't just collecting information. She was building trust, brick by careful brick, with two boys who had learned that adults were often the source of danger rather than safety. The police investigation moved quickly once Maria made her calls. Tony Ramirez wasn't just a neglectful guardian. He was part of a trafficking network that used foster children as commodities. The boys hadn't been abandoned. They'd escaped. Alex had grabbed Ben and run when he overheard Tony making arrangements to hand them over to someone else entirely. As the social workers and police discussed emergency placement options, David found himself in the hospital corridor that had once felt like home. Sarah joined him, both of them watching through the window as Alex tried to coax Ben into drinking apple juice. "I can't believe you found them." Sarah's voice carried layers of meaning. They both knew David hadn't been the same since Marcus and Emma died. He'd retreated from hospital work, from the world, from everything that reminded him of the life he'd lost. David studied the boys through the glass. Alex's protective positioning never wavered, his small body constantly angled to shield Ben from potential threats. Ben's silence spoke volumes about trauma that went deeper than physical injuries. These weren't just children in crisis. They were survivors who had saved themselves. Maria emerged from her phone calls with news that David had been dreading. Emergency foster placements were full. The county shelter was their only immediate option, a place where traumatized children would be lost among adults fighting their own demons. David had seen kids disappear into that system before. Sometimes they emerged stronger. Often, they didn't emerge at all. The decision formed before David fully realized he was making it. These boys needed stability, medical care, and someone who understood trauma. They needed what Marcus had always said their home was meant to provide, a safe harbor for children who had weathered storms no child should face. "I have emergency foster certification." David's words hung in the sterile air between them. "I can take them tonight." Sarah studied his face, recognizing the determination that had once made David one of the hospital's most respected pediatricians. She also saw something else. Purpose. The first real spark of life she'd witnessed in him since the funeral. Emergency placements sometimes work best when they feel less like placements and more like homecomings. When children who have been treated as burdens finally meet adults who see them as blessings. When trauma meets healing and fear discovers it can coexist with hope. The foster system isn't perfect, but sometimes it delivers exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. Sometimes rescue flows both ways. David's suburban home felt impossibly quiet as he guided Alex and Ben through the front door. The house that had echoed with emptiness for 3 years suddenly seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if it could remember how to be a home again. Alex stepped carefully across the threshold, his eyes scanning every corner like a soldier checking for threats. Ben pressed close behind him, his silence more profound in the warmth of an actual house. The living room still bore traces of the life David had shared with Marcus and Emma. Family photos lined the mantel, their faces frozen in happier times. Alex noticed them immediately, his gaze lingering on the image of David with another man and a little girl, all three laughing at some forgotten joke. For the first time since leaving the hospital, Alex spoke without being asked a question. "You had a family." His English carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned it out of necessity rather than choice. David followed the boy's gaze to the photographs, feeling the familiar ache that accompanied any acknowledgement of his loss. "I did. They're not here anymore." David's voice remained steady, though something in his chest tightened at having to explain loss to children who already carried too much of it. The guest room had become a storage space over the years, filled with boxes David hadn't been able to face sorting. But behind those containers, the space still held 2 twin beds from when he and Marcus had dreamed of fostering siblings. They'd bought the beds with such hope, planning for children who would fill their home with laughter and chaos. David had never imagined those beds would finally be used under circumstances like these. Alex tested the mattress with his hand before allowing Ben to sit down. Even here, even safe, his protective instincts never wavered. Ben's eyes darted between David and the door, as if calculating escape routes even in what was meant to be sanctuary. Mrs. Peterson from the elementary school called the next morning while David was attempting to make breakfast that 2 traumatized children might actually eat. The principal's voice carried the barely concealed disapproval that David had learned to recognize over years of being an openly gay man in a small community. "We'll need extensive documentation before we can enroll these children." Mrs. Peterson's words came wrapped in bureaucratic courtesy, but David heard the underlying message. She wasn't just questioning the boy's paperwork, she was questioning him. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at David's door later that afternoon, introducing herself as the school's art teacher. Unlike her principal, Carmen Rodriguez looked at Alex and Ben with eyes that recognized trauma and knew how to meet it with gentle strength. She spoke to the boys in fluid Spanish, her voice carrying warmth that transcended language barriers. "I grew up speaking 2 languages too," Mrs. Rodriguez told Alex as Ben peered at her from behind his brother. "Sometimes it takes time to find your voice in a new place, but you will find it." The neighborhood's reaction arrived in waves. Mr. and Mrs. Walsh from next door brought over a casserole and genuine smiles, their kindness unmarked by judgment. But the Johnson family across the street watched from their windows with expressions that made David's skin crawl. By evening, a petition was circulating online, questioning whether single gay men should be allowed to foster vulnerable children. The local news van appeared on Tuesday morning, drawn by social media chatter about the unusual placement. David watched from his kitchen window as the reporter set up her shot, preparing to turn his family's private struggle into public entertainment. Alex noticed the camera too, his body tensing with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that attention often meant danger. Dr. Sarah Kim called that evening with news that shifted everything. "The hospital board wants you back, David. Your handling of this case reminded them why you were one of our best pediatricians." But David could hear the hesitation in her voice, the unspoken recognition that returning to hospital work meant facing the same discrimination that had driven him away. In Mexico, Elena Gutierrez received a phone call that shattered her carefully ordered world. The police officer's Spanish was formal and distant as he explained that her daughter Sophia's children were alive, safe, but in the custody of a man Elena had never heard of. She had grieved Sophia's death 8 months ago, never knowing that her daughter had left behind twins who shared Elena's own dark eyes and stubborn chin. That night, as David checked on the boys before bed, he found them huddled together in one of the twin beds despite having 2 to choose from. Alex's arm wrapped protectively around Ben, both of them sleeping fitfully in a tangle of limbs that spoke of survival learned too young. David adjusted their blankets and found himself remembering Marcus's voice from their early conversations about fostering. "Sometimes children teach us more about family than we ever teach them." Marcus had said that while they were filling out their first foster application, before Emma came into their lives, before everything changed. Looking at Alex and Ben now, David began to understand what Marcus had meant. Trauma bonding creates connections that traditional families take years to develop. When children survive crisis together, they often form attachments deeper than biology, stronger than convention. Foster families work best when they recognize that healing happens in layers, that trust builds slowly, and that love sometimes arrives wearing work clothes instead of Sunday best. Sometimes the families we create from crisis become more resilient than the ones we inherit from chance. Jennifer Martinez spread the legal documents across her mahogany desk like pieces of a complex puzzle. As one of the state's most experienced LGBTQ family attorneys, she had seen cases like David's before, but none quite this complicated. A gay widower, two traumatized Latino boys, and a grandmother from Mexico who wanted custody. The law would favor biology over love, tradition over progress. Elena Gutierrez arrived in the United States with determination etched into every line of her weathered face. Father Miguel accompanied her, the elderly priest serving as both translator and moral support. Elena had spent weeks preparing for this moment, learning basic English phrases and gathering every document that proved her connection to Alex and Ben. She carried Sophia's birth certificate, baby photos, and the weight of 8 months of grief she hadn't known was incomplete. The first meeting took place in Maria Santos's office, neutral territory where raw emotion could be contained within professional boundaries. Elena sat across from David, studying the man who had somehow become central to her grandson's lives. She saw kindness in his eyes, but also something that unsettled her. The way Alex and Ben positioned themselves closer to David than to her. The grandmother they had never known existed. When Elena spoke in halting English, her words carried the authority of blood relation and cultural tradition. These boys belong with family, with their people. They need to know where they come from. Father Miguel translated when her emotions overwhelmed her vocabulary. His voice gentler than her accusations, but no less certain. David listened without defending himself, recognizing the profound loss that drove Elena's demands. She wasn't just fighting for custody. She was fighting to reclaim the daughter she had lost, to honor Sophia's memory by raising the children Sophia couldn't. But when Ben pressed closer to David's side and Alex's jaw tightened with familiar defiance, David knew this battle would reshape all their lives. Judge Patricia Hernandez presided over the custody hearings with the careful neutrality that came from years of making impossible decisions. As a Latina herself, she understood Elena's cultural arguments. As a family court judge, she had seen too many children damaged by well-meaning adults who prioritized tradition over trauma recovery. The courtroom became a theater where expert witnesses performed careful choreography around the central question. Could a gay man provide what these Latino boys needed? Or did blood and culture trump love and stability? Dr. Amanda Foster, the child psychologist, testified about attachment patterns and trauma recovery. Her clinical language couldn't capture the way Ben had finally started speaking again. Only to David, only in whispers, only when he felt completely safe. Robert Chen, Elena's attorney, presented his case with surgical precision. He spoke about cultural identity, religious values, and the importance of children knowing their heritage. He didn't say the word gay, but it hung in the courtroom air like smoke, unspoken but undeniably present in every argument about traditional family structures and appropriate role models. Elena's testimony carried the weight of generational wisdom and maternal instinct. She spoke about Sophia as a child, about family traditions that Alex and Ben had never experienced, about the extended family in Mexico who were eager to welcome them home. When she cried, her tears seemed to echo with centuries of grandmothers fighting to keep families together. David's testimony was quieter, but no less powerful. He spoke about trauma recovery, about the medical care the boys still needed, about the careful progress Ben had made towards speaking again. He talked about Alex's protective instincts and how they were slowly transforming from desperate survival tactics into healthy sibling bonds. He didn't mention Marcus or Emma, but everyone in the courtroom could hear their ghosts in his voice. The school's situation deteriorated while the legal battle intensified. Alex got into fights with classmates who repeated their parents' whispered concerns about gay foster fathers. Ben's selective mutism returned during the most stressful court weeks, his hard-won progress vanishing under the pressure of uncertain futures. Mrs. Rodriguez found herself running interference between the boys and Mrs. Peterson, whose disapproval had crystallized into active obstruction. Media attention reached a fever pitch when a viral video surfaced. Someone had recorded Alex defending David to a news reporter. The 6-year-old's fierce loyalty broadcast across social media platforms. He's not trying to be our dad because he's lonely. He's taking care of us because that's what good people do. The video drew both support and backlash, turning a private family crisis into a public referendum on LGBTQ parenting rights. Dr. Sarah Kim watched the proceedings from the hospital where she was finally preparing to come out to her colleagues. David's courage in fighting for Alex and Ben had inspired her own battle against discrimination. If David could face a courtroom full of strangers questioning his right to love these children, she could face a medical staff questioning her right to be herself. Jake Morrison entered David's life during this chaos, not as a romantic possibility, but as Alex's art teacher dealing with a boy whose drawings had become increasingly dark and violent. Jake understood the complexity of single fatherhood, having raised his daughter Mia after his own difficult divorce. He recognized something in David that had nothing to do with sexuality and everything to do with the fierce protectiveness that good parents develop when their children are threatened. The temporary custody ruling came down like a thunderclap on a clear day. Judge Hernandez, bound by precedent and cultural considerations, granted Elena temporary custody pending the final hearing. The boys would go to Mexico for a trial period, allowing the court to evaluate Elena's ability to provide for them while maintaining their connection to David through supervised visits. Legal battles involving children reveal the complicated intersection between love and law, between individual rights and cultural preservation. When families are formed through crisis rather than birth, the courts must weigh attachment against ancestry, stability against tradition. Sometimes the most loving decision feels like loss to everyone involved. Sometimes justice looks different from every angle. And the only certain truth is that children deserve adults who will fight for their well-being, even when that fight becomes public, painful, and unclear. Elena's temporary apartment felt like a battlefield disguised as a home. Alex sat rigid on the edge of the couch, his protective instincts on high alert as his grandmother attempted to bridge 8 months of lost time in a few short weeks. Ben had retreated into complete silence again, communicating only through desperate glances at his brother whenever Elena tried to engage him in conversation. The cultural immersion Elena had planned became a daily struggle. She cooked traditional meals that the boys picked at without enthusiasm. She spoke to them in Spanish about Sofia, about family they had never known, about traditions that felt foreign despite flowing through their blood. Father Miguel watched with growing concern as the boys' emotional withdrawal deepened with each passing day. David's supervised visits became lifelines that Alex and Ben counted down to with desperate anticipation. During their twice-weekly meetings, Ben would whisper his first words since the custody change. Always the same question. When can we go home? David's answer never varied. I'm working on it. Buddy, just hold on a little longer. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning when Ben collapsed at the local school Elena had enrolled him in. The school nurse called an ambulance, recognizing the symptoms of a severe panic attack in a child too young to understand what was happening to his body. Elena rode in the ambulance, holding Ben's small hand while calling David in broken English mixed with panicked Spanish. At the hospital, Ben's condition revealed the depth of his psychological trauma. Dr. Amanda Foster arrived to conduct an emergency evaluation, documenting how the custody change had triggered a complete regression in Ben's healing process. His selective mutism had returned with a vengeance, his anxiety manifesting in physical symptoms that medication couldn't touch. Elena spent that night in Ben's hospital room, watching David maintain a bedside vigil despite having no legal right to be there. She saw how Ben's vital signs stabilized when David spoke softly to him, how Alex finally relaxed enough to fall asleep only when David pulled up a chair beside Ben's bed. For the first time, Elena began to question whether blood was truly thicker than the bonds forged through trauma and healing. Father Miguel found Elena crying in the hospital chapel at 3 a.m. His counsel came wrapped in gentle wisdom about love taking many forms, about family being defined by care rather than genetics. He reminded her that Sophia had always been independent, strong-willed, choosing her own path even when it differed from Elena's expectations. The breakthrough came when Ben whispered his first words in days. Not to Elena, not to the doctors, but to David. Papa David, don't leave me. The raw anguish in those 4 words shattered Elena's resolve like glass meeting stone. She finally understood that taking these boys from David wasn't honoring Sophia's memory. It was repeating the mistakes that had driven Sophia away from home in the first place. Elena's decision to withdraw her custody petition surprised everyone except Father Miguel. She announced her choice in fluent English that she had been secretly practicing, her words carefully chosen to convey dignity rather than defeat. I want to be their abuela, not their replacement mother. They already have someone who loves them like a father should. Judge Patricia Hernandez crafted an innovative custody arrangement that honored both love and heritage. David retained primary custody while Elena was granted generous visitation rights and the role of cultural educator. The boys would spend summers in Mexico, learning about their mother's family while maintaining the stability they had found with David. The joint custody agreement celebration was quiet, held in David's living room with Elena, Father Miguel, Jake Morrison and his daughter Mia, Dr. Sarah Kim, and Mrs. Rodriguez all gathered around the coffee table. Alex and Ben sat close to David, but for the first time since Elena's arrival, they also allowed their grandmother to hold them without stiffening. Jake's relationship with David had developed slowly during the crisis, both men recognizing that love built during trauma required careful tending. Mia had become like a sister to Alex and Ben, their blended family growing organically around shared meals and homework sessions. When Jake finally moved in 6 months later, it felt like the natural evolution of something that had been building all along. Elena returned to Mexico with a promise to come back for Christmas and a photo of Alex and Ben laughing with David and Jake in their backyard. Father Miguel helped her understand that sometimes letting go was the deepest expression of love. That family could stretch across borders and definitions without breaking. The first Dia de los Muertos celebration in David's home honored both Sophia and Marcus, creating a bridge between loss and acceptance that all 4 generations could cross together. Elena taught David and Jake how to make traditional offerings, while the boys created artwork that blended Mexican traditions with their new family's customs. Dr. Sarah Kim's coming out at the hospital had been inspired by David's courage, leading to policy changes that protected LGBTQ medical staff from discrimination. Mrs. Rodriguez started a diversity program at the elementary school, using Alex and Ben's story as an example of how families could be both different and beautiful. 2 years later, David returned to hospital practice with renewed purpose, specializing in trauma recovery for children in foster care. Alex channeled his protective instincts into peer mediation, helping other kids navigate playground conflicts. Ben found his voice through art therapy, creating paintings that captured both his pain and his healing. Sometimes the families we choose become stronger than the ones we inherit. Sometimes love requires legal battles, cultural bridges, and the courage to redefine what home means. When we fight for children who have already survived the unthinkable, we discover that family isn't about perfection or tradition. It's about showing up, holding space, and refusing to let go even when the world questions our right to love. Have you ever had to fight for someone you love, even when others question your right to that relationship? Share your story because someone needs to know they're not alone in their battle for acceptance. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more tales of chosen family, unexpected healing, and the quiet revolutions that happen when love refuses to fit into traditional boxes.